We continue our discussion of evolution with a couple of key words that need to be defined, those words being species and population. Species, as I imagine all of you would come up with, is a group of individuals with similar traits. Oh, hey, those two things look the same. They must be in the same species. Think about two, maybe even different breeds of dogs. How different or how similar do things have to be in order to be considered to be in the same species? Well, a Great Dane and a Chihuahua can be pretty different, and yet apparently they have enough traits in common that they are of the same species. What about something like a horse and a donkey? They have a lot of traits in common, a lot of similarities between them, but this is where we need to go a little bit further. A group of individuals with similar traits capable of breeding. Can a horse and a donkey breed together? They have a lot of similar traits, but can they breed together? And the answer to that is actually yes, they can. But we have to take that one final step then. A group of individuals with similar traits capable of breeding fertile offspring. And that's where the horse-donkey combination gets in trouble. When a horse and a donkey breed together, and they can successfully breed together, what they produce is a mule. But if you know anything at all about a mule, it's that they are sterile. They are not fertile. So that is sort of the final line in the sand that cannot be crossed. A horse and a donkey are not of the same species. Yes, they have a lot of similar traits. Yes, they're even capable of breeding with each other, successfully breeding. But when they breed, what they breed is a sterile offspring, not a fertile one, and therefore they are not of the same species. Then the idea of population would simply be members of the same species living in a defined geographic area. For instance, you could talk about the white-tailed deer population of Pennsylvania. We've named a species and we've defined an area. We could make that area smaller, the white-tailed deer population of Adams County. Okay? Any way you look at it, though, it does come back to that breeding, because members of the same species living in and around the same area, they breed with one another. And that is key as we talk about evolution, because, as I have stated earlier, individuals do not evolve. You are born with your traits. You are therefore born with your DNA. You're going to die with that same DNA. However, populations do change. That's what evolves. Over the course of generations, as individuals die and others are born, populations change. And so population and species are important definitions, and those two go along very much with this idea of gene pool, simply the total number of genes from every individual within a population, because those genes determine the traits, which is what we look at as we define whether things are evolving or not. Now, how picky can we get about this evolution thing? We can add numbers to it. Two phrases here, or two words, allele or gene frequency and genotype frequency, are simply measurements of certain genes or traits within a population. So as we talk about change, as we talk about evolution, we're talking about traits over time changing. Well, we can measure that. What's the frequency, for instance, of a particular gene in a population, and does that frequency change as generations come and go? And we can say the same thing about a genotype. Homozygous dominant, heterozygous, what percentage of a population has a particular genotype? And again, does it change as generations come and go? That's how picky we can get about evolution. I know when we all think of evolution, we tend to think of massive amounts of change and one species becoming another species and branching off and so on. But it can be as simple and as small as the percentage of a gene in a population. Let's say that one particular gene represents 30% of the genes in the gene pool. And then 1,000 years go by. The traits maybe haven't changed, but that same trait now represents 70% of the genes in the gene pool. Has that population evolved? Yes, it has. It has the same traits, the individuals look the same, but that population as a whole has changed. Is it possible not to change? Well, yes. There's a term at the bottom of the screen here called genetic equilibrium, a condition in which the allele frequencies and genotype frequencies do not change within a population from generation to generation. In other words, if a population is in genetic equilibrium, it is not evolving. That's an important condition as we talk about what is known as the Hardy-Weinberg Principle. The principle states that gene frequencies in a population will remain constant unless one or more factors cause the frequencies to change. In order to remain constant, in order to not evolve, there's a certain set of conditions that that population has to achieve. In other words, there must be random mating. In other words, individuals can't be choosing their mate based on certain traits. It just has to be random. There must be a large population because small populations fall prey to just chance happenings. And so in order to be stable, in order to have genetic equilibrium, population has to be reasonably large. To stay the same, there must be no migration. Individuals can't leave because, of course, then they take their traits with them. Individuals can't enter because then they bring their traits with them. And so if we want our population to stay the same, to not evolve, there can be no migration. There can be no mutations because mutations, they provide change. They provide diversity. They provide difference and variety within a population. And so, again, if you want a population to stay the same, there can be no mutations. And finally, as we learned earlier about natural selection, there can be none of that. There can be no competition for limited natural resources, no favoring of individuals with advantageous traits, because of course that too causes change as generations come and go. So what we have set up here is kind of an idealized circumstance. Is it possible for a population to remain the same? Well, yes, but it must meet these 5 conditions that we're talking about here. And it's important to define those because then we can say just the opposite. What are the things that cause a population to change? What are the things that force a population to come out of genetic equilibrium and therefore evolve?